Typically, there's three main ways that people deal with anxiety. The first is avoidance. You avoid whatever you perceive to be the trigger of the anxiety. The second is some form of self-medication. So it could be recreational drugs, it could be alcohol, it could even be food as a form of self-medication. And then the third thing is distraction. So I wasn't using self-medication, but I was using distraction. So I was endlessly watching TV and avoiding people, and that got me to a point of hopelessness. Luckily, at that point, a thought went into my head of, well, now I'm invincible because nothing can be worse than not existing.
Hi, I'm Jennifer Devine, and this is the Successfou podcast. This week, we are graced with the presence of Adam Cox. Adam is one of the world's most innovative hypnotherapists and a world-class entrepreneur. He developed an interest in hypnosis at the age of 14, launching a PR agency at 23 years old, became a self-made millionaire at the age of 27. He was a radio presenter for UK National Radio, and he's now most well-known as a hypnotherapist to celebrities, CEOs, and even royalty. He is the host of 2 podcasts on the iTunes chart, Modern Mindset and The Hypnotist, with over 250,000 downloads per month. And he joins us today to tell us his Successful story.
So I think my journey into hypnosis really came from crippling low self-worth as a child. So I was a very shy, introverted child, and I didn't realize it until much later, but I had this belief that I wasn't good enough. And it came with a positive silver lining, even though I didn't realize it at the time. And that was because I had this unconscious belief that I wasn't good enough, I wanted to get better. And I remember being 11, 12 years old, going to the library a lot, reading books on psychology, and it was always things aimed at improving my life in some way. So it might be fitness or nutrition or speed reading and memory and all these kind of things. And I remember reading a few books when I was 12 or 13 years old about hypnosis. And back then it was stage hypnosis. So there was a book about stage hypnosis by Ormond McGill. He's quite well known in the stage hypnosis community. So I was learning about suggestibility techniques and the importance of tonality. And this is, quite young, 12, 13 years old. But it came from a place of me wanting to improve myself. And then largely I forgot about that kind of stuff. There was a TV show quite popular in the UK around when I was like 14, 15, The Hypnotic World of Paul McKenna. Paul McKenna is now known mainly as a personal development kind of author. Back then he was kind of a stage hypnotist. And again, I found it fascinating. And it was all these little seeds that were kind of planted in my mind. The real catalyst for me is my first year, ironically, doing a psychology degree at university. A combination of things. I broke my front tooth in half. I had a skin rash. And this combined with kind of living away from home just increased social anxiety. And there was a bit of a chain reaction, but I became a recluse for about a year.
At 15? Sorry.
At 19.
At 19.
And at 18. I was 18, reaching 19. And for that first year away from home, it was just kind of like hiding away from the world in all honesty. Did enough to pass my first year of psychology, but mainly what I was doing is using, again, the library. This was a helpful resource. I knew I had severe anxiety. I knew that if I went to a doctor and said, I'm feeling this way, they would have probably diagnosed me with depression or generalized anxiety disorder, put me on medication, and I knew I didn't want that. So I had this kind of feeling that, I didn't like how I was feeling and I wanted to change it. And I was doing psychology. Let me learn if there's some way of fixing myself. So I learned all about different therapeutic modalities, things like, counseling and psychotherapy and psychoanalysis, none of which felt like it was designed to create change. It was just designed to listen. And then I stumbled across clinical hypnotherapy and a kind of a fringe of that, NLP, because they were modeling Richard Bandler and John Grinder were modeling Milton Erickson in the early days to create what they call the meta model and the Milton model. So I just learned all this kind of stuff, and then I became my first client. I was a guinea pig and felt that I could change my emotional state, change my belief systems, and I was able to go from effectively a recluse to someone that set up a business quite young, got to a certain level of financial success.
So that was through self-hypnosis. So you hypnotized yourself.
Yeah.
How did you do that? You just recorded, you wrote something down saying, positive like affirmations or?
Yeah, it was partly self-hypnosis in the sense that some self-hypnosis is done by recording your voice and then listening it back. So these days, I'm probably one of my, biggest fans of my podcast because I listen back to the sessions that I feel are going to impact me. So it's my voice, but I'm listening to my own voice through a recording. Back then it was in a dialogue. And it's difficult to go really deep when you're using in a dialogue as a form of self-hypnosis, because to get to the right words, you need your conscious to kind of activate them, so you can't get really deep. But it was effective enough for me to make some changes and get out of a very dark place. And
that's incredible.
Yeah, I was suicidal at the time. I remember there was one day where I was kind of on the edge of this flat in Luton looking down at the pavement. And for about 15, 20 minutes, just kind of seriously considering like diving headfirst into the pavement because I couldn't see how it would be feasible to continue living my life the way I was living my life. But then it came with a thought, and I don't know where the thought came from, but that thought was, well, if I'm willing to consider not existing at all, then what do I have to lose by trying stuff? And in a weird way, the fact that I seriously considered ending my life gave me a superpower to think, well, whatever I try now is going to be infinitely better than if I didn't exist at all. So it gave me like a weird reframe in that moment.
God, you're so lucky. I mean, that you had those ideas come to you.
Yeah.
For those unfamiliar with what hypnosis is, can you explain it, whether it be self-hypnosis or being hypnotized by someone else? And maybe they're the same thing. Just explain the difference between those two things and just what is it? What's happening? How does it work?
Yeah. So that sounds like it's a really obvious question with a really obvious answer. But you ask 10 different hypnotists what hypnosis is, you'll get 10 different answers. So there's a lot of subjectivity into what hypnosis is. Generally, it's agreed upon that there's an element of suggestion, that hypnotherapy, rather than stage hypnosis, is designed to create some kind of therapeutic change. It's meant to be positive in some way. There is disagreement as to whether or not hypnosis is a state or not. There is disagreement as to whether there is an unconscious that even exists. A lot of people consider it a model or a metaphor rather than something measurable and tangible. But at some level, it's this idea of a catalyst for change. That's how, I've thought about this a lot. My definition is harnessing the power of the imagination to create positive change. And that's a model that is helpful for me. But equally, I'm sure there would be other hypnotists shaking their head at this point saying, well, I disagree entirely. It's something entirely different. No one really agrees on what hypnosis is, but they do agree that it's helpful and they agree that it's useful. And you can actually measure the results even if you can't measure what the thing is.
Do you, in all the people that you have hypnotized, do you keep your own data statistics about degrees of success? And can you share any of those law of averages, if you will?
Yeah, so I'm a pragmatist rather than an academic, and there are lots of meta studies. I did a postgraduate qualification in clinical hypnotherapy, so I have a psychology degree, and then 2 postgraduate qualifications actually accredited with the university. Very few people in the world of hypnotherapy have that. And part of getting those qualifications is that I needed to kind of create let's say, assignments linked to peer-reviewed journals. So I was on Google Scholar a lot looking at these kind of quantitative and qualitative and meta studies of hypnosis. And generally the themes are that if you have a control group and you compare it with hypnosis, the hypnosis compared to the control group has quicker change that lasts longer compared to the group that doesn't have hypnosis. And that's whether you look at pain or weight loss or addictions or whatever it might be. Generally, it's verified in peer-reviewed journals to have efficacy is really the key thing. In terms of my own anecdotal thing, I would say a lot of my clients come from word of mouth, and a lot of them will, let's say, introduce me to other people because they've experienced some kind of positive change. But in terms of turning it into like a large sample clinical trial where it's kind of like, now click this box here and check this and all this, I'm not really interested in that. What I am interested in, almost every session that I start with a client is, tell me what success looks like. If the work we do together is successful, how will you know? And therefore, the overall kind of success metric isn't, percentages or numbers on a scale. It's, did the client have the breakthrough they were looking for? And if they did, then that's successful. You mentioned my podcast, which I guess is another metric. Because I publish so much of what I do, I'm one of the very few hypnotherapists that confidentially share my hypnosis sessions. So you'll never know who the client is, but you can hear my voice. And since I started that about 4.5 years ago, there's been 10 million downloads. So that gives me a clue that it's been useful. And I get messages every day of people I've never actually worked with face-to-face saying, I've quit smoking, I've lost weight, I couldn't fly on a plane and now I can.
Wow.
So I hear this all the time. So, that isn't strong enough to end up in, a journal, but anecdotally, it gives me conviction that what I do helps.
How do you get that? Because I think there's a certain level of trust that has to occur between you and your clients. How do you get that trust? Like, how do they just lay back and just listen? I mean, not the ones who go to Spotify, like me. You just put your headphones on or just listen to it and, deeply relax or fall asleep or whatever it is you're trying to do. But your clients who you work with face-to-face, or how do you get them to trust you?
Yeah, so for the first maybe 5 years of being a hypnotherapist, I was based in Harley Street, and I would see clients face-to-face. And, for the very first few months, I had the academic knowledge, but I didn't have any practice. And I would say that's where trust and confidence is at its most crucial, because you're kind of blagging a little bit in the early days. And what I found is by being based in Harley Street, that gave an unconscious suggestion that I was already successful because I had a high profile location. There's certain things called prestige. So the certificate that you might have behind you, the clothes that you wear. So wearing a three-piece suit, an expensive tie, a nice watch, had unconscious evaluations. This man is successful. He knows what he's doing, all these kind of things.
Yeah.
In the early days, I don't wear three-piece suits anymore, and I don't feel like I need those other things, because now my conviction comes from, several thousand clients that I've worked with. But in the early days, it helped me and it helped the clients to give this unconscious suggestion of competency, which then becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. So these principles that I work with clients, I also apply them on myself, and it's kind of like, okay, the very moment they have that first initial consultation call, they're evaluating my tonality. Let's say I had upward inflection in my voice and I looked unsure, I had facial expressions of uncertainty when I'm working with a client. All of this is hypnosis, all of it is suggestions. So therefore, I had to have absolute conviction in my abilities, and that element of certainty that I had, you've got this thing called mirror neurons. I then project that to the client. But obviously, that was only in the first few months. When I had lots of success with clients, then I've got 100% certainty in myself, and then I can project that to the client, and then that gives me more certainty. So it's the early days that's the tricky bit.
That's the first I've heard of that. What is a mirror neuron?
So a mirror neuron is kind of the neurons that exist within the brain that mimic effectively. So most people have had this experience of being on a pavement or a sidewalk, and as the person gets to you, they go to the left, you go, and you kind of matching them like this weird kind of dance. That would be mirror neurons. Another example of a mirror neuron is if I was to yawn and we're in rapport, you might feel an urge to yawn too. So these are these kind of things, and it helps to accelerate learning, because it's much easier to learn through copying and mimicking before you figure out how to do it yourself.
I don't know what it's called, but I remember a long time ago when I was in sales, there was mirroring. I didn't know it was so technical, though, to be like part of neuroscience as well.
Yeah.
But when you mirror someone, they feel more comfortable.
Yeah, so that's a rapport building technique. Mirroring is part of what's called pacing and leading. So a lot of people will unconsciously match the breathing rate or the volume level and the tonality and the posture and those kind of things. So, because otherwise it would be weird. Like if you were loud and I was very quiet, that tends to break rapport. Mm-hmm. Whereas if we're kind of generally matching, you're in rapport, and rapport is one of the fundamental ingredients for therapy, because you can't really influence someone if you're not in rapport. So mirroring is a key part of that.
Did you work as a psychologist before starting the hypnosis? And do you still practice as a psychologist, or do you mostly just do hypnosis?
Yeah. So hypnotherapy is a form of psychotherapy, and psychotherapy is aligned with psychology. I have a psychology degree, but I was never a British Psychological Association certified psychologist. I didn't want to be a psychologist. Typically in the UK, to be a psychologist, you either have to work for the NHS or you work in private. And if you work in private, generally, that isn't so much on a counselling perspective. That's more in a, let's say, occupational psychology and other kind of things. For me, I started my career in media. I worked in a radio station. I then worked in a PR agency, and then I set up a broadcast PR agency. So my initial success didn't come from the world of psychology, but interestingly, I was taking my fascination with psychology and communication and taking it into that industry. So that person I mentioned before, Richard Bandler, who was one of the pioneers, the founders of neurolinguistic programming, he actually wrote a book on utilizing NLP for influence, and it was called Persuasion Engineering. And when I first got a job in actually sales in media, I was like, great, I get to practice all of these things like body language and eye movements and, even the use of language. So that really helped me when I became a therapist, because in many ways, therapy is selling someone on the change that they already want to make themselves, but they haven't been able to get to that place. So it became helpful.
So I want to kind of go over some of the most common issues or like real successes, but I think you've had so many that might be a boring question. Unless there's any like extreme successes. I'm also really interested in talking about your celebrity clients and how do your celebrity clients differ from normal people contacting you to get hypnotherapy.
I mean, I can mention a couple of those just because normally there's a confidentiality, but there's a couple that I did for free in exchange for being able to talk about them. So I can talk about that. I'm just trying to think like really significant ones. There's a couple that's coming to mind.
I guess what I'm really interested in knowing is how effective is hypnosis for addiction treatment, for drug, alcoholism. I've seen a lot for weight loss. In fact, I've listened to your podcast on Spotify for someone you did a hypnosis session for, wanted to love to run outdoors again. And I go on dog walks, but I'm always so paranoid and self-conscious to run outdoors. I always see a neighbor, or, my village is so small. And I listened to it, and then I started on my dog walks starting to run. I was like, no, I love running outdoors. It really worked. I thought, well, this is great.
It inspired me too. The lady I was working with there was, I think she was in her early 70s, and she used to do ultra runs, like 100-mile runs. And she hadn't done it for a while, and she wanted to kind of lose weight, be more active. And she lives on a tiny island, and it was very dark and rainy. And just kind of working with her, knowing that this kind of someone older and kind of in a less hospitable kind of place was going out for runs, I started running. It was that kind of comparison. When I work with people, I always try and calibrate to them. The reason running worked for her is that she associated running with a positive, empowering time in her life, and she also had evidence that she could do it. So it was the right strategy for her. In the same way that a high-protein, low-carb diet, generally is proven to be quite a good weight loss technique. But if someone's a vegan, it's very difficult to have some kind of paleo or Atkins kind of strategy. So I'm very conscious that I have to link to the value system and the strategies of an individual that I'm working with. So a lot of my sessions, I'm spending, a good half an hour normally eliciting resource states or strategies from the individual so that the hypnosis solidifies a change that's actually going to work for them. And that's the key difference between working one-on-one. I've got this controversial thing that I say about my recordings, because you're right, I publish more hypnosis than pretty much anyone alive. And I don't believe that to be real hypnosis. I believe it to be recordings of real hypnosis, but real hypnosis requires someone in front of you because then you've got a diagnostic component. You're asking about client outcomes, resource state strategies, but you can also calibrate. So that ability to kind of pick up on information while you're doing it, you can't do with a recording because you don't know who that person is. But if someone's in front of you, if you see, an expression of like a furrowed brow, it's kind of like, no, they're rejecting that. I need to take a different turn. Or if they're kind of nodding their head, or, you see them smiling, it's like, oh, they're in a place where that is conducive to change. So you get the calibration with a real person that you can't ever do with a recording.
And how often do you do hypnosis for addiction, for drug, alcoholism? What else do people get addicted to? Cigarettes, nicotine? And how successful is it? I've read some studies that were really promising.
Yeah. So the interesting thing about addiction is that one of the definitions of addiction is that someone simply can't make a change. But that also kind of defines a habit because it's become unconscious. So one of the things that I try and do very early on in a client session is to reframe it so they don't perceive it to be an addiction, just a habit. Because the connotation is it's easier to change a habit than it is an addiction, if that makes sense. Mm-hmm. And there's a couple of anecdotes that I would use. I would say, well, look, of course, someone really addicted to a drug would do anything to get that drug. They would steal from people they love, they would lie, they would do anything. And I've worked with people that, think they're addicted to cocaine, but if their dealer isn't willing to drop it off outside of their home, they wouldn't walk, 5 minutes in the rain to get that cocaine. So is that an addiction? No, that's just kind of like they're doing something that they perceive as pleasurable and it's super convenient. So I'm looking at these ways to kind of frame it as something easier to change rather than an addiction. Because people have this connotation that if it's an addiction, you have to go on a 12-step program, you have to be in rehab, you have to have these horrible withdrawals and all this kind of stuff. And a lot of the time that isn't true. The actual statistics on kind of addictions, I've not really looked at. Like I say, I'm not really an academic. I'm more of a kind of a pragmatist in these kind of things. One of the most interesting things that I found with addictions is this almost kind of polarity, this duality. There's a part of them that really desperately wants to change, and there's a part of them that totally doesn't. And it's this kind of tug of war that's happening within them. And you see this a lot around January resolutions where people make a resolution, they're really committed to quitting that thing, whatever it is, and then literally 3 days later they're doing it. So they're pulled in different directions. And there's an element of working with those conflicted parts, and hypnosis can be a way of working with those. And I always used to think that these parts were like a metaphor, that people would say, oh, there's a part of me that wants to change, there's a part of me that doesn't. And it's a model, like when you see in a cartoon, there's a devil on one shoulder and an angel on the other. Until I met a farmer who had lost his wife, she'd left him, he was in the process of losing lots of farmland and his entire business. And his thing was crack cocaine. He had lots of fingernails missing, teeth missing, and he'd come all the way from like rural England, come to Harley Street to see me. And he desperately wanted to change because he was losing everything. And I was working with that part. And then I said, look, and he was deep in trance. I said, like, I want the part that doesn't want to change to come present. I've never been freaked out in a client session, but in that moment, it was like Gollum and Smeagol, if you've ever seen Lord of the Rings. Like,
I'm probably the only one on the planet who hasn't.
It was like this mild-mannered farmer, his face contorted. He had like a bitter, angry voice, and that part didn't want to change. And I had little chills going down the back of my neck because in my head, parts were just a metaphor. But it was like when you hear stories of like split personalities, multiple personality disorders, a different version of this person came about, and that could not give a fuck about losing family and farmland and money and all that kind of stuff. It would do anything to get that crack cocaine. And at that point, I was like, wow, this has changed my belief system about how these things work. So, I would say true addictions can be quite difficult. How I tend to work with an addiction is you say, look, there is some positive intention behind that. A lot of people will take alcohol to deal with stress or anxiety. A lot of people will deal with smoking because it feels like some kind of reward because it gives them a dopamine boost. if you can get the same underlying need in a different way, then actually you can not have this psychological game of whack-a-mole where they just quit one thing and start something else. You get this thing where you can meet the need in an elegant way where they don't need that thing. And I frame a lot of addictions as, well, you've got a positive intention, but you're choosing the wrong vehicle. Like that vehicle to deal with stress, that vehicle to deal with, anger or whatever it is. What if that's not the only vehicle that works? And then that's how we create change. But addictions aren't the easiest thing to change, because if they were easy to change,
no one would have them.
Nobody would have an addiction. But it's the fact that they've already tried to change and can't. That's why they're going to someone new. And what's interesting about hypnotists, generally they're at the bottom of a long list of help that they're seeking. They've already tried rehab. They've already tried medication. They've already tried some kind of counseling or support group. And at that point, they're kind of like, I might as well try something else. And that's a great thing being a hypnotherapist, because the fact that they've tried almost everything else gives a huge amount of emotional leverage, because they can see a very bleak future if change doesn't take place. But equally, you're working with the people that everyone else has already tried to work with. And that's what makes it so satisfying, because you can actually impact someone that's almost at the brink of giving up, if that makes sense. So that's, for me, it's really rewarding.
Were you able to help the farmer?
I'll tell you what was interesting about that one. I think it was just before COVID. And I offered him sessions, but he's not a tech-savvy guy, and I couldn't actually see him. So unfortunately, I never knew what happened with that particular farmer. And in many ways, like, he was the one that got away in many ways. But so I never knew what happened to him.
Yeah, I think sometimes it might be, I know there's brain changes. I'm going to have a doctor podcast on, like a brain scientist soon, trying to secure that.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm going to get through all those questions, try to understand more about the brain with all of that, because I think it's helpful for people with various addictions or habitual things that maybe aren't addictions, but they're just not good for us, whether it's too much sugar or
there's definitely a neurological
laziness
element to it, because it's a reward mechanism.
Yeah.
Anything that, and people think, things have to be really pleasurable. A lot of addictions are just numbing pain, but the absence of pain feels like a reward emotionally and psychologically, and that's why people continue to do it. And that might be doom scrolling on social media. It's kind of like distraction, can be addictive, and binge watching Netflix can be addictive. And there's all these different kind of things. But fundamentally, people aren't trying to ruin their life. It's meeting some kind of underlying need, and that's the most effective way to create change, is that you meet the need in a new way, so that you introduce choice. Otherwise, people continue what they're doing because it kind of works at some level.
So you're known for working with celebrities and high-profile clients. How does this differ from working with the general public?
It doesn't. The only thing that makes it different is that there is more of a desire for confidentiality with high-profile people, because it could affect people's perception on them and what they're all about, and they have an image to protect that might lead to roles and opportunities and those kind of things. So they take confidentiality a lot more seriously. For me, confidentiality is such an important thing, because, I even tell clients that they could tell me they've murdered someone and nobody will ever hear that. It's that level of confidentiality. There's a few exceptions to that. And in the early days when I was building a reputation as being a hypnotherapist, because I owned a PR agency, we would reach out to celebrities and say, hey, we've got access to a Harley Street hypnotherapist, which was me. So I had a team working with me, and they'll say, look, he's happy to do a free session in exchange for kind of feedback. And there was one particular case that was positive and it was frustrating at the same time. So there was a reality TV star who had been on Love Island, was doing certain kind of things, wanted to get into music, but when she was at school, she had trauma linked to being mocked by schoolmates. Was offered a role on Celebrity X Factor, but felt really daunted with that because of her experiences. We did one session. Regression to that Effectively, it was kind of, call it a rewind technique, basically disassociating, rewinding it, taking away the kinesthetic feeling, and then seeing how she would have wanted it to have been in that moment. Just a single session, and she got quite far in Celebrity X Factor. And part of the agreement was that, she would contribute towards some kind of press release that we were going to put out. And annoyingly, it was in all of the tabloids. And it was just, Zara has kind of worked with a hypnotist. And I was like, no, we agreed, like, me as the hypnotist, but,
Oh, so you weren't named.
Weren't named. But at the same, and I was very frustrated at the time because I thought, like, this is kind of like going back on an agreement and this kind of stuff. But it was just the newspaper that kind of ran with the story. She was well known. I wasn't well known at the time. So therefore, to introduce my name would just confuse the audience. Now it would be different because I have a podcast with lots of listeners, but at the time it was just like, it made more sense for it to be a hypnotist. She didn't realize that the press release was going out that way. And but yeah, she referred her own family members to work with me. So I know I had an impact, and she did well on that, and she's got quite a successful career now. I'm not taking the credit for her career, but I can take credit for reducing anxiety for one specific issue that she had. And there's numerous cases of people like that, but fundamentally it doesn't change the approach. It's just you're sat with someone that, is well known. That's the only variable that makes a difference. But it's also a credibility boost with me because I'm aware that when people hear that I've worked with celebrities and royalty and high profile people in business, again, that same prestige that we talked about with the nice suit and the certificate on the wall behind you, it's kind of like, okay, well, if these kind of people are working with this person, then he can definitely help me. And I will harness any kind of psychological shortcut I can to create more positive change for the clients that I work with. And that tends to be a little bit of sprinkling of positive belief systems, adds to the prestige, and that increases efficacy in the work.
Hi, it's Jennifer Devine, and you're listening to the Successfou podcast. Thank you so much for being here. It means a lot to me. If you're liking the content, let me know by hitting the like button. And if you haven't already, please subscribe, and then you won't miss out on any future episodes. And if there's someone you think could benefit from this information or watching and listening and finding inspirational, please share it with them. Now, let's get back to the show. I think there's a lot of young people who can use it for anxiety. And it seems like there's so many kids off school. And you were saying when you were younger, you were like a recluse for a year. And I don't know what that looked like for you. Were you indoors, couldn't go to work or school?
Yeah, it was first year of university. So for me, it was, certainly impeded my ability to kind of go to university. Still passed the year,
What stopped you, though? What stopped you from going to school? Like, what thoughts were you thinking? What was going on for you at the time?
Yeah, I think for me, my particular type of anxiety was social anxiety. So I think a lot of it was because I had feelings of low self-worth. It was kind of like, I'm going to be judged. I knew that I was anxious. And when you're anxious, that can change how you communicate, how you come across. And it was this feeling of, I don't want to be seen this way, if that makes sense, which when you have social anxiety, the reason that I became a recluse is that being around people made me anxious. And therefore, if you avoid people, that's the coping strategy to mitigate the anxiety. So again, it then becomes more difficult to be around people because then it has this connotation that it's a trigger of anxiety. And I could back that up because I had these heart rate monitors, and just leaving my tiny little apartment, my heart rate was getting to like 190, 200 beats per minute. I wasn't sprinting. This was just opening the door to leave, and therefore you get this weird thing with human psychology that if the emotion is real, then people make the assumption that the thought connected to the emotion is also real. So like any child that gets excited about Father Christmas and Santa Claus, that excitement is real, and therefore they make the belief that Santa has to be real too because the emotion is real. But actually, it doesn't have to be the case. You can have real emotions based in a false belief system, and that was happening with me. So avoidance. Typically, there's three main ways that people deal with anxiety. The first is avoidance. You avoid whatever you perceive to be the trigger of the anxiety. The second is some form of self-medication. So it could be recreational drugs, it could be alcohol, it could even be food as a form of self-medication. And then the third thing is distraction. So I wasn't using self-medication, but I was using distraction. So I was endlessly watching TV and avoiding people. And that got me to a point of hopelessness. And luckily, at that point, a thought went into my head of, well, now I'm invincible because nothing can be worse than not existing. But if I hadn't had that thought, who knows? It could be a different reality.
So what would you recommend for someone who might be listening to this and is in that spot in their 12, 14, 16, 20, any age really, and they can't get their head around leaving the house to go see a hypnotist, like you did with self-hypnosis? What can they do as a baby step?
I think as a baby step, if you can't deal with people, this is one of the reasons that I have a podcast, because I thought, what resource would have been helpful to me in a similar kind of situation? So I've got 2,000 odd real hypnosis sessions that, what teenager, what young adult doesn't have a smartphone? So therefore, my therapy is accessible and completely free to anyone, and they can just scroll through and find something relevant for them. So that's a nice baby step that might have some kind of positive impact. I was asked on a podcast a few years ago, if I could go back to any day and relive it, what day would I relive? And they were expecting me to say the birth of my son, my daughter, something like that. And the idea popped into my head that I would go back and relive one of my darkest days of kind of hopelessness and anxiety and, just crippling low self-worth, on the basis that if I lived that for a day and then went back to my reality, every day is beautiful, every day is wonderful. So I would say anyone listening to this going through a dark time, actually, it does have a silver lining. It will give you a level of resilience that you do not and can't appreciate now. You will only appreciate it when your life gets better. And when you go through a tough time, you'll be like, this is nothing, because you've been in such a dark place and got through it. But you have to have the belief that you can get through that dark place. And I had a feeling that I would get through it because I was willing to try different stuff. But actually, I went from being a recluse crippled by anxiety to being very comfortable taking risk, very comfortable. So I became self-employed at the age of 23. On paper, I was a self-made millionaire at the age of 27. And part of it because the evaluations that I were making was on this basis of, nothing can be as bad as what I've already experienced. And it became a superpower. And I could not have predicted that at the time, but it was only later looking back that you join up the dots and it makes sense. So I would say people going through a dark time, what if it's the making of you rather than the breaking of you?
That's incredible. I mean, it's also incredible success to have such resilience.
Yeah, I think a lot of people talk about, teenage anxiety like it's a bad thing, like it's a natural thing. Find me a teenager that's never been anxious. They're not a real teenager. They're a robot dressed as a teenager. Like, anxiety is natural. Feelings of awkwardness is natural. Feeling stressed is natural. Feeling pressure is natural. The thing isn't to avoid those. It's to realize that you can get through them. And that's the real resilience. It's not the avoidance of pain and difficult things, but the realization that you can go through that and become stronger and wiser because you've gone through those things. And there's so many people scared to do things in case they get anxious or in case they feel pressure. It's like, no, do the thing, feel the pressure, feel the stress, feel the anxiety, and guess what? You will adapt. You will adapt physically and neurologically to become better able to handle these kind of situations. It's like fitness. The first day you go for a jog, you can't go very far, but you keep doing it, you can get further. Emotionally, it's a very similar thing. Like, if you do these things that are difficult, you're going to be better able to cope with those same kind of things.
Yeah. I always say that being a teenager is just, it's the art of having endless awkward moments, feeling uncomfortable in your body. It grows and changes so quickly, and in a crowd and everyone around you, and your schools change, and you grow up so quick. And it's just awkward and uncomfortable.
Yeah, because you don't have the perspective at that point.
Yeah.
Everything, it's kind of like when you're a young child, like the summer break seems to last forever.
Yeah.
Because as a percentage of your life, it is a significant part. But when you're 40 or 50, 6 weeks, relative to the life you've lived, isn't that much. It's the same with emotions. If you're 13 or 14 and you're feeling really sad, and it's the first time you've had that level of sadness, it feels unbearable because you don't have enough reference points in your life to realize that you can feel that and get through that. And I think that's the key thing, because when things feel unbearable, it's a logical thought to think, I can't stand this. I have to get away from that. And that's why suicidal thoughts kind of pop into their heads, particularly of teenagers, because it's appealing. It's kind of like, I get to avoid this emotional pain. Okay, it kind of makes sense.
With this whole idea of suicide, which is on the rise for young people and young men in particular, very sadly and shockingly, is that you framed it in a different way for someone once. It's the death of your childhood sometimes going into adulthood.
Yeah.
You grow so rapidly through adolescence with emotions in your body and
I'd love to say it was my idea. I heard it, but I think good concepts can be borrowed and utilized. And I think the essence of it was that, what if becoming an adult is the metaphorical death of childhood, adolescence, as you become an adult? And therefore suicidal thoughts isn't because there's a desire to actually physically die. It's because you have to die in the form that you are. And adulthood is just the evolution of that. I think there's an element of that. I also think it's an appealing thought for people that are in a dark place and can't see how things are going to get better. There is a secondary gain as well to this idea of physically checking out of life. And that secondary gain is that we don't have to plan too far ahead in the future. All of these things like major life decisions, if you don't plan on hanging around for too long, it kind of takes a lot of that pressure off. So I do think there is an element of why it would make sense for people to think those things. But a great way of framing suicide is that it is a permanent solution to a temporary problem. And I can relate to that, because when I was 19 years old and hopeless, life wasn't good for me at that particular point. And therefore, not living seems like a logical solution to emotional and psychological pain. It feels unbearable. But that would have been a permanent, let's say, way of resolving that. And my life is pretty good now, but I wouldn't be experiencing this good life if I would have made that decision earlier. And now I can see that kind of dark period of my life actually gave me a level of perspective and resilience that's been really helpful. But if I would have checked out when I was 19 years old, I wouldn't have harnessed the benefit of all of that resilience.
Life only gets better, right? No matter how great. I had great teenage years. Had loved being 16 in the middle of nowhere, Minnesota on a lake. Great summers. Everything was fun. But life has gotten so much better. It only gets better and better.
I think it does for some people. I think it doesn't for everyone. Some people, the best years of their life were when they were younger. And, that's where regret and kind of reliving past moments isn't helpful, because then you're like, everything's just getting worse and worse. But interestingly, the emotions that you feel tend to be a reflection not of reality, but of evaluations of perception. So for you, you're clearly in a good place because you believe that life is getting better and better. If you believe that life is getting worse and worse and worse, you would probably feel very different. So it's not the reality, it's the evaluation and the perception that's such an important thing. And a good therapist will do a reframe, and they'll take whatever they're feeling and say, but what if it's like that, but from this perspective, and give it a new meaning? The thing is the same, but the meaning is different. So my period of anxiety, I now perceive it as it gave me perspective and resilience. But someone else could give it a different meaning, and they could say, well, my life is shit now because I had this horrible thing when I was 19 years old. The thing is the same. It's just the meaning of it that's different.
So it's really your thinking about it, the thoughts you're thinking about that time or those facts at a point in time, And it's changing those thoughts, looking at it from a different perspective. Because if you change the thought, we all know that our feelings come from our thoughts and our actions come from our feelings. So is that sort of the center of what you do as a hypnotist and with us?
It's one step deeper than that. So that element of Robert Dilts called it logical levels. So you've got your environment. So you've seen people happier on a sunny day compared to a rainy day. Okay, so the environment can affect the mood. And then it might be, let's say, the behaviors that people make. Some people do things that aren't conducive. So if you ate a load of high sugar processed food, that might affect your sleep and your mood and those kind of things. So behavior does it. So you've got those, and thoughts can affect behavior, and emotions definitely can affect, the thoughts and behaviors and those things. What I tend to do is to look at the values and the belief systems, because if you change the thoughts are fleeting. Thoughts come and they go all the time. But beliefs tend to be a bit more kind of static and have more longevity. So the thinking I have about that period of my life is definitely different, because the belief I have is different. And a good reframe gives a new meaning, and a meaning is a belief about what is true about that particular thing. So I believe that was the making of me now. But that's just because I have a belief about that, and I would call that an empowering belief.
Was that the belief you told yourself at the time?
Not at the time, no.
That in the future, I'm going to look on this and this is going to be...
No. It would have been a great belief to have. I just didn't know how to get to that belief at that time. I framed it in a different way, and that is that one of the things that I utilize a lot in hypnosis is this idea of time. That there is, the past is the past. You can give different meanings to the past, but you have infinite possible futures. And I considered, when I was 19 years old, 2 possible futures, because it's good to make it binary so you get to a point of change. One was the future as if change didn't take place. If I was this socially anxious recluse and I mapped that future out, what does life look like for me? Yeah, it was pretty shit. It was pretty bleak. Like it wasn't a good life.
If nothing ever changes.
Yeah, but then I looked at it from a different perspective and say, well, look, if I try different things and if I can get over this, then what if I can change this thing, I can change other things? What does that life look like? And that looked like a life that was really appealing. It was kind of like, I knew I didn't want to be an employee. I wanted to have my own business. I knew, I had this idea. I had a belief that I'd be financially successful. Even at the time, I had no reason to believe that. And I had all these kind of thoughts, and it's kind of like, well, I'm much more likely to have that future if I try different stuff and I'm willing to kind of step into the abyss rather than walk away from it. And that became a self-fulfilling prophecy. So it wasn't that I gave it a different meaning. I gave it a different meaning when I was out of that dark place and looked back. Actually, it was a willingness to say, well, look, I've got kind of 2 broad futures here, one of which I don't really want. So therefore, do whatever I can to avoid that future and live a different life. And in doing so, that gives you a few wins, that boosts your confidence, that gives you some momentum, and then suddenly you're in a different thing. And you can call that hope, or you can call that belief, or you can call it anything you want. But the key thing, I think it's a misattributed Einstein quote, something like, if you keep doing what you've always done, you'll keep getting what you've always got. Or the definition of insanity is doing the same thing and getting different results. So I had to do something different, and I chose to kind of face the fears rather than run away from them, and that was useful for me.
What's the most important thing you'd like people to know about hypnosis?
Hypnosis is one of many, many different things that can create change. I would say I like hypnosis. I put hypnosis on the therapeutic spectrum where it's designed to create rapid change. And there's things like counseling, which a lot of people think all therapy is. So it's just, you speak to someone for an hour a week for years and years and years and hope that change takes place. Counseling is kind of non-interventional change. Like sometimes they might reflect back a few statements of words, but it's not really designed to create change. It's designed to create, empathy and understanding and those kind of things. Hypnosis is at the end of the therapeutic spectrum that change is the whole point. But it's not the only way that you can create a change. Sometimes I would say a decision can create a change. An intention can create a change. A moment of inspiration can create a change. So if someone's listening to this and they're struggling, I don't want them to think hypnosis is the only thing that's going to help me, and if that can't help me, nothing can. No, try it. If it works for you, it works for you, and if it doesn't, something else will work. But the idea that nothing exists that can change your emotions, your belief system, and improve the quality of your life, how likely is that to be true?
In the show notes, I'll put a bunch of data facts about studies that have been done. When I was reading them last night, I thought it was incredibly promising. I might start using it for more things.
I find it...
my cupboards, you know.
I mean, having a couple of thousand episodes on different hypnosis, I've done hypnosis sessions for such random things. Like, yeah, there's been moments of like deep trauma, like hardcore addictions and intense phobias. But, you know, I've had people use hypnosis to feel confident doing a TV interview. People use hypnosis to increase their libido. People use hypnosis to have the confidence to approach someone that they're attracted to. Use hypnosis to kind of manifest their dream life, like all kinds of random things. And it's kind of like this. I think a lot of people think it's kind of like, oh, okay, it's used for weight loss and smoking and, you know, these kind of things. But it's kind of like, it's quite a versatile tool, because what most people consider therapy is to deal with a problem. But I would say a problem is just the inverse of an outcome that you haven't had yet, because that's where I start with a problem. So it's kind of like, well, if you're listening to this thinking, well, I don't have loads of problems, I don't feel anxious and I don't feel this. Okay, are you living your absolute dream life? And if you're not, well, then your problem is that you're not living that life, and maybe hypnosis can help you to get more of that life that you want to live. It doesn't have to be that you have some kind of intrusive thoughts or PTSD symptoms, or, you know, you're binging or bulimic. It could just be, you know, you want to have more confidence to take more risks, or you want to be more organized, or you want to deal with procrastination in a different way, or you just want to live more of the life that you want to live.
What is the most common thing you're asked to hypnotize people for?
I would say the three key things that are the most popular, I would say weight loss, anxiety, and sleep.
Weight loss, anxiety, and sleep.
Yeah.
And what about trauma? Do you think hypnosis can help people who've experienced trauma, whether they've been in a war, like a real war, or they've been in a personal war? You know.
Yeah. Most people, I would say most people have had some kind of traumatic experience, or at least that they perceive themselves to be, but trauma is subjective. So, you know, these teenagers that, you know, slipped and embarrassed themselves, you know, that would be traumatic for them. It's going to feel like their whole world's come crumbling down. Equally, it might be someone in the military that's had an arm blown off. You know, like, trauma is subjective, but it can be traumatic for that individual. And I would say what tends to be the human body's response to trauma is vigilance, and the extreme level of that is hypervigilance, because the brain does not want to feel that way again. And I would say a lot of these, like a phobia, for example, is an overreaction to an undesirable sensitizing event quite often. So I remember working with this gentleman, and he's like, oh, I've got this irrational fear of dogs. It's like, okay, irrational fear. Like, tell me what happened. Like, when was the first experience that you can remember? I was about 5 years old, and the neighbor had a big dog, and it was barking at me. And I was like, how tall would you have been when you were 5 years old? It's like, oh, about this big. How tall would the dog have been barking up against the fence when you were that age? Like this. So I was like, you're about 6 foot now. What would happen if there was a 12-foot loud thing this far away from your face? Do you think that would be a, you know, feeling anxious might be like a natural response? Like, oh, totally, yeah. So it's like, so your brain didn't like that feeling, and now it's trying to mitigate that by being very aware of anything that looks like a dog and keeping your distance. It's not an irrational fear. That's a very rational fear. Do you want to keep it? No. Well, let's change it, you know. And it's just looking at things where change, people don't want to feel like there's something wrong with them. They don't want to feel broken. And my approach is that I don't believe any of my clients are broken. You know, I kind of reject this idea of mental health because it has this idea that people are sick and broken. I don't think they are. I just think they've learned things that, you know, are suboptimal, and actually giving them more choice and different ways of thinking about the thing gives them a different meaning to it, and more options about how they deal with that going forward. Quite often, an addiction is a perceived lack of choice about how to deal with a particular thing, and then it becomes the only thing that you keep on doing. And it's kind of like the idea that a particular recreational drug is the only way that you could manage your emotional state. Come on, how realistic is that? There's lots of different things that could do that. But it doesn't feel like it in the moment, and that's why it feels, so compulsive.
What would you say to someone who's really inspired by you and is like, oh, wait a minute, I want to help people in that way. I want to learn how to be a hypnotist. What would you recommend they do? Like, how do you become a hypnotist?
Yeah, so there's lots of courses. And I would say, if anyone's thinking that, what a wonderful thought, because I would say it's a very fulfilling thing, because you get to do something that's creative, intellectually demanding. I consider every client like a puzzle. I've got the pieces, but I don't know how it's going to look. And it's a wonderful thing if you get feedback that actually you've had some kind of positive impact on someone's life. So if anyone's feeling that way, whether they become a hypnotherapist or some other kind of helper of the world in some way, I mean, that's a wonderful thought. Hypnotherapy, I would say there's so many resources online. There's lots of academies. There's lots of things. I would just say do your research to find someone that knows what they're talking about. That, unfortunately, there's lots of poor quality trainers that don't even believe their stuff, and they're doing it just because they can kind of monetize it. But there are very credible things. I would say there's a couple of online academies. The Mike Mendel Academy, I think, is very good. The Jacquin, so Anthony and Freddie Jacquin, father and son team, they have an academy. I would say the conferences. I mean, I speak at a lot of the hypnosis conferences, but if you're looking for a way of learning a lot of hypnosis in a very short period, the world's biggest conference is in Vegas, Hypnothoughts Live, tends to be every July, and you've got a choice of 50 different speakers there, all teaching different elements. Yeah, I speak at Hypnothoughts. There's the one in London, and that tends to be around October. I'm speaking at the one in Dublin in April. So you've got all these conferences, and I would say a lot of the people speaking at these conferences also offer training. I don't offer hypnotherapy training. I just like speaking at these conferences because I think it's helpful to people. But there are trainers there that do this kind of thing, and then you get to actually kind of see who you connect with, who you resonate with, and if that's useful for you.
The hypnosis session we did yesterday for teenage anxiety and depression. Do you want to say anything about that for Blue Monday?
What that session was about, normally when I do a hypnosis session, the person in front of me is the client and I'm calibrating the hypnosis. We did something slightly different in the sense that you had a very clear idea of who you wanted it to help, and it would be a teenager or young adult feeling overwhelmed with either anxiety, sadness, or hopelessness, and we created a whole session around that. And there was various metaphors, breathing techniques, and ways of thinking about it that would be more empowering. I think there's certain things in there. One of the key things that I think is really helpful is to be open to the idea of a better future. The idea that a better future exists, I think, is one of the most important things, because it creates hope and it creates resourcefulness. And the session allows you to kind of wonder, what could that future be? And I think when I mentioned I was in that place of feeling suicidal and feeling hopeless, it was, I could see a bleak future, but I could also see a future that was pretty incredible. And if I didn't think of that other incredible future, well, then things like suicide and addictions feels quite appealing, because that's the only future. So just having an idea of a more desirable future can give a sense of meaning, a sense of purpose, a sense of drive. And that's what the hypnosis recording will allow you to not guarantee that you see, but encounter the possibility that it exists. And that's all it takes, is to not know for sure it's going to happen, but be open to the possibility that there is a better future that exists for you.
Yeah. So if people go to Spotify or Apple Podcasts, because I know you're wherever anyone gets podcasts, you're on all of the platforms.
True.
And is it The Hypnotist, or do they look for Adam Cox? If they're searching, how do all of your...
The Hypnotist is the best place to look for. If you were to put The Hypnotist in any of these, you're going to see my bald head and an orange logo of The Hypnotist. and scroll through and find what you're looking for. But this one will have teenage depression or something like that in the title. So have a look for that. But equally, you can scroll through and you might find something else there that really resonates with you. But what I would say about what you find on the podcast is that these are real hypnosis sessions created for real clients. About 99% of them. Occasionally I create sessions inspired by books and movies and things like that don't have a real client behind. But most of them are. They were created for someone real. So you're getting a sense of you're getting some real therapy. And if you're similar to the original client that I was working for, then you're getting, what other people have spent hundreds for free, just because it's suitable for you.
So our live audience, do you have any questions?
Oh, well, one thing I was wondering actually was, like, did something in your childhood ever inspire you to get into this career? Like, what were your that's kind of another question, but like, what were your parents like? Were they kind of into this sort of thing as well, and did that inspire you at all?
Yeah, you were saying at 11 and 12 you first learned about hypnosis.
Even at a young age, I had a passion for learning, because it was kind of, not because I loved learning, it's because I wanted to get better, to kind of fix myself. Where I really can say that my parents helped on my journey is there was a local library, 10-minute walk from my house, and they would encourage us. My mum really took time to teach me to read. Apparently, I was a very young reader, and I think that probably created a desire to kind of read, and then going into a library, and then looking for stuff, like being curious. But weirdly, my parents find what I do odd and unusual. My mum has genuinely said to me, like, why couldn't I have done something normal, like be a plumber or an electrician? So it certainly wasn't something that I was encouraged to kind of follow this kind of thing. If anything, I would say it's the opposite. But I think some people might be like me in the sense that there's a polarity response. One of the best things my mum ever said to me is that, I could never do the kind of things that she could do. And that kind of lack of belief in me, I don't know if it was reverse psychology or she actually believed that, but it unleashed a desire to prove people wrong. And I love when people underestimate me, write me off, because it just creates this wonderful fuck you response in me that says, watch me. And I do.
That's great. Where does that come from?
I'm not sure. I think a lot of people have a polarity response. A lot of the things that people's parents tell them not to do, they have an irresistible desire to do. I think there's a rebelliousness in a lot of people, a seek of finding your own identity. But I think that low self-worth, weirdly, was in a weird cocktail of kind of high levels of ambition. I had this weird thing where I didn't think I was very good at anything, and yet I had a belief that I would end up doing well. And it was this weird thing that is kind of like, it doesn't make any sense, but it was kind of like I had to figure a way out of that kind of maze. And for me, hypnosis was the thing. For other people, it could be something else. It could be philosophy, or it could be religion, or it could be something else. But for me, it was a desire to kind of figure out a way out of my maze. And in doing so, I then thought, well, maybe I could show a couple of people out of their maze, and nobody wants to be lost in a maze. But if you are, and you found your way out, why wouldn't you want to help other people out of a similar situation?
Yeah, you get a big charge from helping others.
Absolutely.
And that brings me to my last question, which is going to be a tradition I'm starting. I'm going to ask everyone this question, because I think parents or mentors, it doesn't have to be your mom or dad, are there any really strong messages you got as a child, really good lifelong lessons or words that you repeat in your head that came from your mom or dad?
I was very young when I set up my first business. And my dad, he just kind of said, he gave me the key advice to not bullshit, to be real, to be authentic. And I felt that was a helpful thing, because I was 23 years old when I set up my first proper business, and I felt that was helpful. And the one thing I think my mum really instilled on me is a work ethic. She was a real worker and not afraid of hard work. So I think that really helped me. But I think that the key penny drop moment for me actually wasn't advice from either of my parents. It was this idea of personal responsibility. And there was a few years where I was looking to blame everyone. It was like blaming my parents, my childhood, situations and this and that. And I think it's such an appealing thing to do, because while everyone else is to blame, you can feel righteous, you can feel like the martyr, you can feel justified. But there was a very bitter pill that I swallowed, and it was this idea of, what if everything in my life somehow is entirely down to me? I'm in this mess, but my thoughts, my beliefs, my actions have got me exactly where I am. And this idea of,
that was wisdom.
Yeah, it was 100% personal responsibility. And it's a very sharp double-edged sword, because you've got to look at yourself in the mirror and say, I'm in this horrible place because of me, no one else. But it gives you a way out of the maze. And I would say, up until that point, I was finger pointing. This shouldn't be like this, and and if this didn't happen, I wouldn't be like this. And then when that belief system of everything in my life, good and bad, is down to me, which of course isn't true, because you've got environmental factors, genetic factors, and all these kind of things. But as a belief, it's such an empowering belief, even though it's not true, that everything in my life is of my doing. And if you truly believe that, then it gives you ownership of, okay, well, what do I believe that have got me into this horrible place? Let me change those beliefs. What am I thinking consistently that's got me into this horrible place? Let me change my thoughts. And it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. But yeah, I would say the belief of personal responsibility. And I think those people that have that personal responsibility can do a lot. And those people that don't, they could have the best education in the world. They could have, the best financial backing. They can have whatever it is. If they're not going to take responsibility for their decisions and their choices and their ability to steer their life in the direction that they want, it's very difficult to help someone like that. And a lot of what I do in therapy is getting people, a lot of people think the therapist is going to change them. No, I'm the catalyst for someone to change within themselves. They've got to be responsible for that change. Otherwise, it's too easy as a way out. They say, oh, it didn't work. It didn't work, or you didn't make it work. And there's this thing, particularly with weight loss, a lot of people believe that they're looking for the right strategy. They're looking for like this diet, this trainer, this scheme, this regime, whatever it might be. Particularly women with children. I say, look, what weight do you want to lose? And they're like, oh, I want to lose like this many pounds or this dress size. And I say, look, if there was an evil wizard that came down from a cloud and took your kids away, and you could only see your kids again if you got to a certain weight, could you do it? And they're like, of course. Because now it's kind of like they could eat that thing or they could see their children again. It's such an easy decision. And therefore, any strategy would work if they were in the right resourceful state. But while they believe that it's not possible for them, they're never going to make that change. So a lot of what I do is getting people into a state where they realize that they have the capability if they access the right resources, and then my job is to get them in that resourceful state. Now the game's winnable. But while it's like, well, I don't think hypnosis is going to work on me, it's going to be a self-fulfilling prophecy. Of course it won't. So then it doesn't.
Yeah, and there probably are. I mean, I've met people who don't believe in hypnosis. They're very resistant. Have you had any in your chair before who are resistant? I don't know if it's going to work. I don't really believe this stuff. And then they suddenly go deeply into a relaxed state.
Oh, yeah.
The suggestions work.
I used to do a monthly workshop, and there would be people with lifelong arachnophobia. Like they've been scared of spiders as long as they can believe. And I would start the workshop and I'd say, like, raise your hand if you're afraid of spiders. Of course, everyone raises it, and it's like a scale of 1 to 10, and they're all like 8, 9s, and 10s.
They just move so fast and they're ugly.
But here's the interesting thing. I would say, like, keep your hand raised if you think you're the only one person here I won't be able to help. Everyone's hand is kept raised, everyone's, because they believe they're the exception to the rule, that I can help everyone else but them.
Or they feel like their fear is so big, because I'd be one of those.
Yeah.
I feel like, no, my fear is so big and so real that nothing's going to help this.
Yeah, because
I can fix anything but that.
Because the emotional intensity is so strong, therefore there's the feeling that, okay, change is more difficult. But that's not true. So all of the but what's interesting is that when you're working with arachnophobia, unless you pre-agree what success looks like, they're going to move the goalposts. Oh yeah, I held this massive tarantula, but you know that's just now, and it'll be different then. So I'd have to get them to agree what's called the convincer strategy. That who of you here could even fathom holding a tarantula? Like they're scared of house spiders. Like, no, could never do that. So therefore, if you hold a tarantula, what does that tell you? That something's changed, right? And they're like, yeah. And if you could hold a tarantula, then seeing that little house spider in your bathroom, that'd be easy, wouldn't it? Oh yeah, that'd be easy. Because they don't believe they're going to be holding the tarantula. 3 hours later, they're all holding a tarantula. And then it's kind of like, well, something's changed, because now they've got a reference point for a new belief that they can do the thing they couldn't do. And there was what worked for me, and what I encourage people to think of whenever they make a change is I say to them, look, let's say you've had a lifelong fear of spiders and we make this change. You could just say, hey, I had this fear of spiders, I don't have it anymore, and you carry on with your life. Or what if you framed it that this thing that I never thought I would ever change, I've changed that, and if I can change that, what else can I change in my life? Well, then it gives you the ability to take your life in the direction of whatever you want to take it. And you use the phobia cure as a metaphor that wonderful change is possible in all different directions. That's way more empowering than just making a change. What if it's just the first domino of a big, long line of dominoes that takes their life in a positive direction rather than just a one-off anomaly? Like, you might as well harness these things to keep things moving in the right direction.
Yeah, I feel like I'm getting hypnotized now. I'm in such a relaxed state listening to you speak. I think it's because I listened to your go to sleep hypnosis session.
And relax.
5, 4, 3, 2, 1. How is magnetism and manifestation related to hypnosis?
Yes.
Or are they related?
Yeah, they are in many ways. So this idea of magnetism comes from a character called Mesmer. He's one of the historical figures of hypnosis. And he believed that hypnosis was like animal magnetism. And he would do these kind of things that we now perceive to be almost like placebo or kind of suggestive kind of things. So he would, have kind of like magnets and iron bars, and he would have them in certain kind of things connected to iron. And what we now know is that that's a suggestion, in the sense that people are thinking, well, there's all these things happening here that I don't understand. It's very similar to how witch doctors and kind of tribal kind of leaders would create, health changes, because the rituals and the shamanistic element actually is conducive, because it's like these things don't make sense. And then you're like, well, something powerful must be happening here. And then it does. It creates this kind of placebo effect. So that's the magnetism thing. What was interesting, I think it was the court of Louis XIV that did a very in-depth study. And they found that when they studied it and measured it, actually, it wasn't down to the magnetism, and then effectively hypnosis disappeared for a while. But then people were curious. It's like, well, while people believed that this magnetism thing was happening, the results were there. People were, getting cured of very kind of, horrible illnesses, and they were feeling better and all this kind of stuff. So that's where this idea of, well, maybe it's the suggestion rather than the magnets that is linked to this thing. Law of attraction and this kind of other element, I would say, of the Venn diagram, they definitely overlap. So I've interviewed a lot of people that were in the documentary The Secret on this idea of law of attraction and those kind of things, and they all say the same thing, and that is that there is certain psychological principles taking place, but the Rhonda Byrne element doesn't focus enough on the action. There's too much of this idea of kind of quantum vibration and all this kind of element. But actually, there is psychological principles taking place. When you have a clear idea of what you want and you believe you have the ability to make that, it kind of acts in the same way that you get cognitive bias for a horoscope, that you think this thing that you want is going to happen, and now you're looking out for it, and then you get that confirmation bias when it does, that you're like, oh, and I saw that in my horoscope. I'm one of these weird people that I'm very cynical, but at the same time, I harness belief systems. I never pass a wishing well without throwing a coin in and making a wish. I have all different kinds of crystals and stones and those kind of things, knowing that it's placebo, but placebo effect works. I have a vision board, and I have manifested a lot of amazing things in my life. But what some people call manifestation, I just call it creating the life that I want, and a lot of those things map across belief, suggestion, inner dialogue, but actually taking action is one of those key things. And I would say what people think law of attraction is vibrating in front of a vision board. It's more like when a business puts a very robust business plan together and they think about making that come true. That's more like what law of attraction really is. It's being very specific on what you want and allocating resources to make it happen.
Can you tell me more about the vision board? How does your vision board work? You put pictures up of what you want and what you want to achieve?
So years ago, I used to have one of those blue pin boards, and I would kind of print stuff off of all the things that I wanted, material things, but also kind of like learning things or success metrics. I'd put them all up on a literally pin it up. That was my vision board. But what I found is that some of these things take more time, and you have to kind of, let's say, research things. And it might be a link here and those kind of things. So, having a successful podcast with millions of listeners, that was on my vision board at one point. But I changed it from a physical vision board to a Trello board. So I'm quite into technology. Trello is just a project management tool. It's like Microsoft Planner. You have these columns. So I have a column for financial success, health and fitness, relationship, business kind of things. And then I state it in the past tense, like I've already achieved it. I have a picture as close as possible to what it would be like to have that. I use certain kind of key things, so like the smart things, like framing it. I use the Tony Robbins massive action plan questions to kind of focus my attention in terms of what would happen if I never achieve it, what resources would I need, how have I done similar things in the past. And so it's very deliberate, but equally, I'm very specific, and it's this weird thing because I have this belief that when I set my mind on something, I will achieve it. And I remember, just a weird anecdote, but when I was, I think 16 years old or something like that, I remember being with a few friends and walking through like a shopping mall, and there was a jeweler's, and there was a specific watch, and it was I still remember it. It was the Tag Kyrium chronograph. And there I was, like 15, 16 years old, and there's this 1,300 pound watch in the window. And I just go in there and I said, can I try it on? And then like snickering and like, hey, you can never afford, like, why are you even trying something on you can't afford? And within a few years, literally, I had that exact same watch in the exact same color in that kind of thing. And it's just kind of like, was that law of attraction? I think so. I set an intention, I knew exactly what I wanted. And then I did what was necessary to get it. Now, is that manifesting it? I bought it. But I bought it from doing things that gave me the resources to make that happen. And I think people treat this word like law of attraction and manifestation like it's magical. Like the Apollo missions, a space flight, that's law of attraction. They're very specific in what they want, and they do something that seems impossible and they make it happen. Like that for me is what law of attraction manifestation is really like. I have a very specific idea of the house that I want in the Caribbean, and I have pictures on my walls of that kind of property and that kind of stuff.
Which island?
So it's probably going to be Grand Cayman or kind of maybe Anguilla or Bahamas. So not specific on the island because I need to do more research on that. But I just know it's going to be beachfront property, with pool, modern kind of style. I can see it in my mind, and probably in a few years' time when I'm living that, and I'll be a recording studio in one room and a gym in the other, I'll be like, did I manifest this, or did I just kind of accumulate the resources to kind of do it? Who knows? Like people will kind of, decide on that, but at some level it's manifested.
Someone once created the analogy of it playing, it's like playing I Spy. If you got the kids in the car and you're like, okay, I spy something green, then suddenly everyone only can see green. And like what you seek, you shall find, I suppose, in a biblical sense.
You have got that I Spy element of priming, because there's this function called the reticular activating system that actually, and it's weird how it works sometimes, because you set an intention and what was invisible before you can now see it. A lot of people do that when they learn a new word. Suddenly, wherever they look, people are saying that word or you're reading that word. It's like the word always existed. It's just it was invisible to you at that particular point. And I feel like there's a lot of that happening when you're very clear on an intention, but you have to believe that the intention is possible or inevitable. And a lot of people don't want to do that because they don't want to feel like a failure. So on my vision board, I have a whole section called Ridiculously Big Goals. And the fact that I frame it as ridiculously big means that I'm not really expecting to do it, but it's not going to stop me trying. And then if I do those ridiculously big, I just feel even better. But it doesn't have that same connotation of I've set a goal and I failed it. It's kind of like, because some things you just want to think really big. And if you think really big, well, what if you
it requires a lot of focus and energy. It's a lot of work to do that. I mean, I don't know why in our culture we don't do that. It seems like we're born doing that. Like when we're little, we want to climb to the top of the monkey bars. We think we can do anything. And then somewhere along the way, we get retrained. Society retrains us. Oh, you can't do this. You can't do that. Right? And then suddenly...
But it comes from a good place. They're trying to protect.
Yeah.
Because, if, nobody wants to see a child, they say, I'm going to be a rock star. It's like, oh, maybe you should lower your expectations a little bit. Because it would be devastating, to really believe that you're going to do amazing things and then fail. But it doesn't have to be that kind of all or nothing. It's kind of like a better question isn't, to lower your expectations or lower your goals, but to think of what kind of person you have to be to make those goals inevitable. It's kind of like, if I just said, I want to have, a beachfront property on the Caribbean, but then not do anything to increase my financial resources to make it possible, then that's delusional. So you have to actually do the work to make it possible. And I think if someone wants to be a rock star and they're just thinking about a rock and roll lifestyle, that's disempowering. If they're learning music, if they're studying different kind of techniques or getting really creative, that's empowering. Like, who are we to say what's possible or not? And here's the interesting thing. I have this firm belief that you either win or you learn. And you're better off setting a big challenging goal.
I like that. Say that again.
So you either win or you learn.
Nice.
Because then even if you don't get the outcome, you get the wisdom. And a lot of people don't do either because they don't want to lose or they don't want to fail. But then you don't get the win or the learn. You get nothing. Mm-hmm. So that's really helped me to take risks and kind of attempt ridiculously big goals, because I don't really care if I get the thing. It's like I want the thing, but I'm quite stoic in the sense that if I don't, well, at least I can be proud that I attempted to do that thing. And who knows, you might surprise yourself.
Yeah, so if you go for it, you either win or you learn.
There's no
failure in going for it.
That's it.
Oh, well, this has been really excellent. Is there any other questions you want to answer that you think would be useful for the audience?
There's one final thing, and that is the question or the misconception that comes up the most about hypnosis is that they're under the control of the hypnotist. And I have a metaphor that I use to help explain more like what's going on. So I say to people, like, if you were lost in a forest and you bumped into someone that knew that forest really, really well, and they could lead you out of the forest, does that mean you're under the control of the person that knows the forest? And they're like, no. And it's like, well, you could walk away whenever you want and find your own way out of the forest, but they know that forest really, really well. You're not being controlled by them. They just can help you get to where you want to get to. And that's more like what hypnosis is. What most people think hypnosis is, or some people, is they've seen Hollywood movies and they've seen stage hypnosis shows, or they've got memories of Scooby-Doo villains where they're kind of hypnotized, and they have this idea that, it's this Machiavellian control element, and it isn't. It's much more like someone knows that terrain very well, and I've worked with enough people in these kind of things that I know that terrain very well, so I can help them escape their forest or escape their maze much quicker than they can do it by themselves. Of course they can do it by themselves, but it just might be quicker to work with someone that knows that space well.
That's a great analogy, actually. The walking out of a forest. I like that. Well, thank you so much. Thank you for your time. Thanks for all of your knowledge and sharing your wisdom. And it's been a pleasure.
It's great to be here. Thank you.
Yes, thank you.